You are listening to Labor Pains, an Injured Worker podcast featuring conversations in workers' compensation and health and safety in Ontario, Canada, and beyond. Labor Pains is produced by Injured Workers Community Legal Clinic and is not a substitute for legal advice. For more information on workers' compensation issues, campaigns, and resources, visit injuredworkersonline.org. Today's episode is hosted by Tabassum Durrani, a lawyer at Injured Workers Community Legal Aid Clinic.
On today's episode, we're talking about a book called Who Killed Sir William? A reflective and analytical look at what happened to the original vision behind Ontario's workers' compensation system, as envisioned by its founder, Sir William Meredith, over 100 years ago, and why that matters more than ever today. The book unpacks a bold research project called RACWI, the Research Action Alliance on the Consequences of Work Injury. Now that might sound somewhat academic, but what RACWI did was pretty revolutionary. It brought injured workers, community activists, and university researchers together to document the long-term impacts of work injuries, economically, socially, and mentally. And more importantly, they didn't just study people, they worked with them, training injured workers to be public speakers and advocates in their own right. The thesis of the book is this: the original promise of workers' compensation has been eroded. Instead of dignity and support, too many injured workers are left isolated, impoverished, and disbelieved. Through storytelling, data, and community-led action, this book asks, who killed that promise? And what can we do to bring it back to life? So in some sense, this episode isn't just about a book. It's also a blueprint for activism. Because in a time when benefits are being clawed back for injured workers, when older workers are being cut off benefits just because they hit age 65, and when the system seems stacked against the very people it was built to protect, this story reminds us that research can be radical and community-led activism is essential. So let's get into it in more detail with one of the authors of Who Killed Sir William, Steve Mantis.
Well, thank you very much, Steve, for joining me today to talk about your book that you wrote with Marion Endicott, Who Killed Sir William. I'd like to start off by asking you about the motivation behind the book, specifically what inspired you after, I guess, a decade since the Research Action Alliance on the Consequences of Work Injury, RACWI, concluded. What inspired you to tell this story when you did, and whether there was a pivotal conversation or moment that compelled you and Marion to decide we need to document this process and the outcome of this unique community-university collaboration.
Our rationale for writing the book was to capture some of the lessons we've learned in terms of linking a community of interest, in our case, the injured worker community, with academics, with researchers, university professors, to study our own experiences, and then to be able to use that information, that research, in change to improve the lives of workers going forward, both on an individual basis, but also collectively. Our initiative was an initiative that went for 8 years, from 2004 to 2012. And along the way, we were able to also see how some of the other programs that were funded under the same envelope, under the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council funding envelope, how the community seemed to be kind of the tag-along rather than really an equal partner. And we thought, well, we've gone beyond that. Like, we have really adopted and tried to ensure that injured workers and our injured worker communities were equal partners in terms of the governance model, our structure, our participation throughout the session, throughout the research initiative. And we thought this is important. And so we tried to capture as much of the detail about how we accomplished that as we could and put it in the book so that it could be used both for injured workers engaging with research, but other social justice groups, as a model, as a way to pick up some of the tools, the techniques, the activities we did along the way, modify them to fit their own situation. But it's a good kind of how-to starting point for many community groups.
The book is obviously about the title of the book references Sir William Meredith. And one of the themes that I guess emerged for me was this almost like systemic decay of his vision for what a workers' compensation system should be. I'm wondering in your view, what have been the key turning points where his vision, or his original vision for injured workers, began to erode? What, from your perspective, are the factors or forces that are most responsible for the decay of that vision?
Well, it was interesting because our project, it was funded under this envelope called the Community University Research Alliance. And we have been building relationships with academics for maybe 10 years, more or less. Here we were, a point in time where there was now a critical mass of academics that were interested in the issues that we were interested in. And we organized ourselves in 4 theme areas. And history was one of our theme areas. Another was policy, practice, and legislation, where we got to study both the history, how the compensation system began, and how it changed over time. And in parallel, look at the policy, the practice, the legislation that also had changed over time. And what we saw was the experiences in workers' compensation paralleled what was happening in our larger society. The move to this kind of neoliberal agenda or austerity agenda or corporate agenda, there's many different terms to describe this, was really taking part starting in the 1980s and has continued to grow and grow up until the present. And what we saw was that the founding principles included a collective liability system. What that means is that we're all in this together, that much like our healthcare system, our OHIP program here in Ontario, you're not dinged if you have to go to the hospital. Your premiums don't go up. And your employer's premiums don't go up. Our public system there for healthcare is funded both by contributions through the employer in terms of what they're paying. They're paying $1 or $2 per 100, depending on the size of the corporation, as well as through our income tax system. In the early 80s, the provincial government had a study that was led by another researcher, Paul Weiler, and he said, well, maybe that collective liability isn't the best system because does it really encourage workplace safety? And so he wrote a big report on many aspects of the compensation system that kind of set a new path forward for workers' compensation. And among that was to move into or away from that collective liability into more of kind of that insurance model where if you have more accidents, you're going to have to pay more money. Like what happens in car insurance. And most people are familiar with that. If you have a car accident, or 2 accidents, you can expect that your premiums are going to go up and up and up. And likewise, if you're a young driver, your rates are going to be much higher with no accident record at all, because when you do all the data, younger drivers are higher risk of accidents. What that has, and so the system has moved slowly in that direction until today in Ontario, we're 100% experience rated, just like your auto insurance. One of the other founding principles that Sir William Meredith, who we reference in the book, one of his founding principles was to move to a system that was non-adversarial. The traditional way to resolve conflicts is to go to the courts. And in the court, you have your two sides. They fight against each other. They bring their evidence forward. I'm right, you're wrong. And it's very adversarial. It's set up as an adversarial system. And what Sir William Meredith saw is that really even the person that won oftentimes was still damaged by that process. And so these two principles, the collective liability and the non-adversarial part of the system, really were hand in hand. And so as we have moved into more of that experience-rated individual responsibility or liability by businesses and corporations, we've seen many aspects of the system move into more adversarial relationships. When I lost my arm in 1978, it was rare that an employer would get involved in trying to figure out involved in an individual claim because there was still a collective liability system. That experience rating didn't come in until the mid 80s, first as a pilot project and then really rolled out fully in the 1990s and continued to grow and manifest in more ways. And now we see employers oftentimes being much more active in challenging claims and engaging consultants and disability managers and all these things because they see there's an economic advantage to them if they engage in the system. And it happens on an individual level with individual injured workers, who are going through the system, but it also has spread really to the larger political, where you've got employer organizations lobbying governments to reduce costs, cut back, and now we see billions of dollars going to corporations as a result of this kind of behavior.
So following from that, I guess talking about the current relevance of this, the current political and economic climate, I guess, particularly in Ontario, why is it so critical now to revisit the history that you recount in the book? And I guess I'm trying to connect to some of the book's themes to today's climate, especially around some of the things you're mentioning, austerity, WSIB policies.
Yeah, so as the workers' compensation system was moving in that area of focusing more attention on reducing costs to employers, we saw in our tax system that same movement. In the mid 1970s, there was the big picture was that corporations paid in gross amount about the same amount in taxes on their profits as we did as a collective for our income tax. It was about a 50-50 split. Over the years, the amount that corporations pay on their profits, the taxes on their profits, they don't pay taxes on all their income like we do, like you and I do. We pay taxes on all our income. They only pay taxes on their profit. That has fallen so that now the ratio is for every dollar that the corporations are paying in taxes, we as citizens pay $3. So this has left a shortage of income for our governments to provide the public services that we all really count on and rely on. So we see that in our healthcare, We see that in our education. Back in the day, a university or college was reasonable fees. Now they're just through the roof. And we hear in terms of our healthcare so much about hallway medicine, the lack of access to doctors, the long wait times. These are all indicators of the lack of funding that are going forward. And then when you connect the dots in terms of safety on the job, two of the biggest sectors now that are experiencing injuries and disabilities on the job are education and healthcare. Because that lack of funding means there's not enough staff to provide the service. Um, the supports that were there in the schools, for instance, for um, kids with various disabilities and challenges are disappearing. So without those supports, there's much more violence that happens. The same in our healthcare sector. The research that's been done, nurses and healthcare staff in hospitals are reporting record levels of violence to them by the patients because of the frustration of this hallway medicine, these long delays that people are kind of going, look, I'm sick, help me, and there's not the capacity of our healthcare system to respond in a timely manner. So that same impact is happening in workers' compensation at the WSIB, where the focus is on cutting costs. The last 15 years, they've been the most successful. Ever since the Harris government in the mid 90s, that has been the focus. Though the Harris government wasn't very effective. They thought they knew how to cut costs, but they weren't actually successful. They contracted out a number of services that had ended up costing more than when they were delivered in-house by employees of the WSIB. Starting in 2010, we had new management there, and they became more effective at actually cutting those costs. And we've seen a reduction in the amount of expenses, money put out by the WSIB by about 50%. And that's resulted in hardships for many workers who end up with especially who end up with a permanent impairment. That's been their focus. Okay, let's make this system really a short-term disability and try to cut out long-term disability, much like private insurance companies have done for years. And the shorter the disability, the shorter times on benefits, the more successful in terms of their corporate goals there is. This is not reflective of whether the outcomes for the workers themselves are improved. It's only about how long are they on benefits. That's the goal. Reduce that number on average. And then, they celebrate those every time they're able to reduce the duration on benefits, ignoring what the impacts are on the actual workers who are there, who need help, who the system was set up to provide that help for.
Thanks, Steve. I want to talk a little bit now just about the role of, activism in research and collaboration, going back to Rockwee. What, from your perspective, makes or made that community university partnership model effective in driving social change? And how do you see that activism as essential to redressing some of these injustices you're talking about in the system within the injured workers movement?
So there's a really a number of factors involved. The funding program that we were able to access theoretically saw that the community and the university should be equal partners. The research that had been done on knowledge mobilization or knowledge transfer has shown that the more deeply you engage with the community of interest in which you're studying, the deeper the engagement, the more impact your research is going to have. So, it's really a value analysis, an economic analysis, that is going, okay, if we're going to provide this money to researchers, what difference is it going to make? So we really grabbed a hold of that. We understood that research, and before we ever actually got any money, we spent about a year and a half building relationships with academics and with ourselves. The theory of being equal with a university professor when you're an injured worker who is struggling to put food on the table, to have housing, to maintain your mental health, when we know that about half of workers with long-term injuries suffer from poverty, from mental illness, oftentimes some kind of addiction or another. It takes a focus, and it takes work, and it takes resources to start leveling that playing field. So simple things like sitting around a room together with 20 people or 25 people and everybody having a chance to talk right at the beginning of the meeting and to share a little bit about themselves on a personal level, and also what their area of interest is or what their priorities are that bring us together. And in those sessions where this is just the introduction, we've got business to do and we've got an agenda that we're going to go through, but spending that time to get to know each other, to get to hear from each other, brings the lived experience to life. And then you take a break and you have coffee and or something to eat, and you're rubbing shoulders and, well, you said XYZ on this issue, tell me more. And the more we got to know each other, the more we saw common purpose, the more we saw that it was possible for us to work together to share power along the way. And then as we moved forward, we developed plans on how to use that money that we were getting from the federal government. They were giving us $1 million. This is 2004, 2005, for a 5-year initiative. So it really stretched for 8 years, some without money. We went on, we saved some money after the 5 years and kept going for another year or two. And we developed a training program, a 5-year program for injured workers in particular, dealing with a range of topics, both about research and how it worked, how to deal with the media, how to talk to politicians and decision makers, how to be a public speaker, how to deal with challenging situations, a whole range of topics. And then we also developed a plan that we called our knowledge translation and exchange. These terms keep on changing, but it's really our action plan. What are we going to do with this research? Where we identified what the main messages that we wanted to focus on, who the audiences were for those messages, and what were some of the ways that we wanted to use to be able to move forward. So, there's these kind of parallel things going on. There's the process that we paid particular attention to ensuring that the voices of workers were front and center all the time. Our experience was you sit in a room with a few injured workers and a few academics. Well, the injured workers, and me, myself included, in the early days, like, you just keep our mouths shut. Like, they're the really smart ones. Like, what do we know? Like we know we're not equal. We're clearly not equal. But along the way, we realized, well, there's things that they really don't know either. And so creating the space for us to do that sharing, um, little tricks as well, language, what's a cohort? What's a qualitative, what's a quantitative study? What are all these terms? Well, we'd have a flip chart there. Any term that people didn't know, okay, we would write it down. On the flip side, the researchers didn't know what a FEL and a NEL was, and a LOE and a RTW, and all these things that were terms we knew. Well, they didn't know them either. So on the other side, we have the other flip chart, with our language. And then we put that together into a living document that we shared all the time, so that people had a little cheat sheet, so to speak, of what these terms are, and to help us, for all of us, to be able to plug in more easily into the conversations and into the discussions. And then we addressed the power issue through a governance agreement, where we said, okay, the philosophy is it's a shared leadership. How does that really play out? And what we saw was that we really had three main partner groups as part of our initiative. We had the injured workers, we had the professionals, lawyers and paralegals and community legal workers, and then we had the academics. And so throughout our structure, we tried to ensure that we had a representative from each of those three groups involved in that leadership role. So, at the top, it was the two of us. Myself was the community lead, and Emil Tampa was the academic lead. Then we had our four main theme areas, and each one of those had a community lead and a university lead, but that professional, the lawyers or the community legal workers, in a way, were there to help mentor the injured workers, so that there was support, on site all the time, because still you're in this learning process and you're trying to figure all this stuff out, to have someone there to kind of go, okay, I've been around for 20 years and I've been doing this, or 30 years or whatever, who has got your back, is really key. Again, it's that issue of that power imbalance, and that helped to kind of balance out. And then so our management group, our steering committee, was made up of those representatives from each of those four theme areas, as well as our PIs and our staff, where we would come together on a regular basis, make plans, monitor those plans, encourage things to happen, to troubleshoot barriers. We spent a lot of time sitting around tables trying to figure stuff out, before and during, when the research actually took place. And then we also would have both ad hoc groups in the early days. We had a worker caucus. As we were setting our goals and our budgets and everything, we had a place for workers and advocates to come together outside of meeting with researchers to kind of go, okay, let's get our heads on straight, so to speak. Let's get a plan going here that we can then collectively advocate when we sit down and we meet with the academics. That only lasted about a year or a year and a half. By that time, we had grown in confidence. We had our structures in place. We were learning more and more. We were getting to know each other. So we didn't need that worker committee any longer. But then we built in other structures as well. so that there were regular interactions, much more focused. So, for instance, we had our things we called community forums, which would be a half-day session, 6 to 8 times a year, where we would focus on the research. It was oftentimes mostly community members and advocates. We have one or two researchers coming and talking about the things that they thought were important, or a research project they were thinking about doing, or that maybe they were midway in their project, or maybe they were finished. Both then to provide feedback in terms of what's that key question. You're doing a survey. What are your questions? How do we understand those questions? And one of the ones that really was example I used a lot. A big research project earlier that was done in conjunction with the WCB asked workers who had a permanent impairment, who whether they were working or not. And then there was another category as I took early retirement. And we know, that early retirement means I'm going to try to maintain my dignity rather than saying I'm unemployed. I'm saying I'll take early retirement. So when you add that cohort, that group of people who say I got early retirement, the unemployment rate goes up considerably. But the researcher didn't understand that, and they just kind of put all those people aside and said, "Oh, we're not going to count them anymore." That's just one example of how you ask the question, what that frame of reference is understood differently, oftentimes by someone making $100,000 or more, and someone who's struggling financially and has a whole different frame of reference. And then we focused on the action. We wanted to do research to make a difference, and that meant taking action. So we didn't even wait till the research is done. Like, research takes forever. Like, you kind of go, what? It's going to take 2-3 years, and then it's going to take another year or two before it's published, and you're not allowed to say anything until it's published because of these are those academic rules. And we went, well, okay, if that's the way you can do it, but we're not going to wait. We're understanding these things. We're going to bring these forward. And one of our main audiences was folks at the WCB, the WSIB. So we went and we met with senior management and developed an agreement that we would work together to use this new research, this new knowledge, to improve services for injured workers. And we were able to actually achieve some of that going forward.
Steve and his co-author Marion Endicott held a book launch at Toronto Steelworker Hall as part of the Toronto Workers' History Project this past May. Here's a clip of Marion talking about some of the experiences that led to writing the book.
Another thing is that injured workers grew in confidence as they had their experiences validated, and they discovered that their lived experience also produced knowledge. Along the way, the academics increasingly acknowledged the strength of the research had been enhanced, not compromised, by the involvement of the study. And this was unexpected to many. The researchers who were involved in the project have told us, some of them, that they entered timidly. They thought this might ruin their career. It might be a dangerous step. But they thought, okay, we'll go with it. And I think that universally all of those who did engage in it were very happy that they did. In battling the logic of the board, injured workers learned that research is not neutral. So when the board says research shows, they knew that there might be a different interpretation. The injured workers benefited by learning how to use research effectively. They learned how to present it with their own story woven in through it. And this was done through the speaker school very effectively, and it was done through role plays. In the book, we have a lot of discussion about role plays, and we have some role plays filled out there that people might find useful. So I want to just take a I read a piece from the book that helps to illustrate the growing of a worker. This is the story of Beryl Brown, and she was speaking at the second symposium of the Brackley project, this is what we say here. Beryl Brown presented on how Rackley had changed her. She explained how she had first encountered Rackley as a shy person, but more than that, as someone who was ashamed of being an injured worker and who was scared to speak publicly for fear of being punished by the compensation system. It was through learning of the history of the injured workers' collective action that she understood that, quote, injured workers have never given up and that progress is made by constantly raising issues. She said, quote, this strengthened my resolve. I was determined to speak up, to take part. I noticed this impact on other injured workers as well. Through this project, I have participated in skits, I have spoken at rallies, and colleges and universities. I have learned to speak.
You mentioned in the book that there was obviously a number of objectives, and it sounds like there were a lot of very positive and transformational things to come out of it. But you also mentioned in the book that Rockweed didn't quite meet all of its objectives. I wonder if you can talk about what you think were the main barriers.
Well, we were faced with different traditions or in academia that we weren't really knowledgeable about. So I understood that there's this publish or perish idea. If you're going to be a university professor, you've got to publish, and then there's their training is don't engage with the community you're studying because you're going to lose your objectivity. You have to maintain a distance. You have to maintain a separation. And so working with us took more time. It took time away from the younger academics in particular who are hoping for a tenured position where they could have been doing more research and publishing more articles. So they were potentially sacrificing some of those career advancement. Whether they were or not, we don't know, but that's the perception, that they're sacrificing really career advancement opportunities to work with us. And we didn't really understand that, and over time we did. Another was that the academics are trained as the higher up you get to use a specialized language. From my perspective, it's like, oh, so that's so that only academics can understand it and the rest of us are left behind, to create that separation to show how special they are. So our expectation was that all of the academics would create plain language summaries that were short about the research they were doing. Well, most researchers were incapable of doing that. They had never been trained in that. They were trained in writing all these detailed pieces with all kinds of formulas and charts and documenting, all this methodology and stuff. So they didn't know how to do that. So trying to gain some of the tools that we needed for our advocacy, they didn't know how to do it. We thought, well, why? What do you mean? You're the smartest guys around. You can't write up a one-page piece? Like what? The other was being public about their research. We thought, okay, we're all partners together. Let's have a press conference about this research because, oh my God, look what it says. It says the system is damaging workers. Well, they were pretty reluctant to engage at that level, to be there at a press conference, to say something that like researchers are like, there's all these qualifiers in almost every research study. Oh yes, we found this, but there's things that maybe we could have missed, or there's more that would have to be done. So they're always kind of hedging their not always, but it's predominant. And you see how this reluctance to say, hey, look, I think this is a real problem. Um, there's a reluctance to say that. And you can see it so clearly, certainly in terms of occupational diseases and exposures, that the science is that we have to prove 100% that it's right. Well, it's almost impossible to do that. But when you're 90% right, that's pretty darn good, But if you're 90% right, you still say, well, we're not entirely sure. So these practices that are common in academia, uh, you know, were limited or created barriers for us. That we thought, okay, because university professors got this credibility we don't have. And you see in the media, these research institutes saying things, they get media attention, and because there's this idea that, oh, these guys are smart, they've been studying it, they've got something to contribute. So that was a challenge. And the last thing I'll mention is, the normal process for researchers is there's one person who's in charge. It's the principal investigator, and they're like a little mini god. They're responsible for all the money coming in, and they get final decision making on all expenses and what happens in their project. We were saying, no, that's not how we're doing this. So, all these years of training and the expectation of this is how it works, it was a challenge for some of the academics to go, okay, it's okay for me to share power, as opposed to, no, I'm in charge. Like, it's the way it's set up to be. So those were some of the barriers that we encountered along the way.
Do you think any of those things are different now than at that point? I'm just thinking, for example, like the willingness of some researchers to be more public and vocal and perhaps more declarative about some of their findings, or no?
Yes, it is changing, and I'm so happy about this. So I've just completed 2 different academic conferences where we were presenting about our book, and all these youngsters I'm 75, so anybody else is a youngster, who seem to be committed social justice advocates who are going through their process to get their PhD, or maybe they're just early researchers who want to make a difference. One of the projects we're working on right now, now this would be like a mid-career researcher, we're working on the issue of claim suppression at workers' compensation. Just this week, working with the official opposition here in Ontario, working with the critic of workers' comp and for injured workers, we were engaging in real time, providing data, providing research for a debate that was happening, within hours in the legislature on these issues. The willingness to talk to reporters, on this same project, we've gotten a number of articles in major publications, that we're only partway through the research. We haven't finished the research, but we're able to share some of the early findings that we're having that are already documented through Freedom of Information requests. The researcher said to me on Wednesday when we were doing some of this stuff, here we are at this conference talking about what the research people are doing, and my role was to try to encourage people to engage deeply with the community of interest. And these are all people around work and health, and injured workers and workers and unions are really the communities of interest. They're presenting in a session and go, who would have thought that as a researcher I would be doing freedom of information requests at the WSIB? Like, that's not something that is in their normal activity. And you could see them kind of having fun with it, feeling like, oh my gosh, maybe I can make a difference. I was part of a panel in the last session at this conference of the Canadian Association of Research on Work and Health, about inclusion. And again, here I just saw so many of these, new or young academics who really want to do something different. They want to make a difference. They haven't been trained on how to do that. You're in the ivory tower. You're not supposed to make a difference. You're just supposed to provide research or evidence and let other people, struggle with that. But I just see that growth, both in the interest of our issues and the increased interest in making a difference, has really grown over the last 20 years, 25 years. And that was one of our goals with our RACWE program, was to really expand the capacity in the academic world to look at our issues, to be able to provide timely support, as well as long-term support, and to be partners in making changes that help people, that help workers, that help our communities. And it was so uplifting to be part of that 20 years later.
So to round things off, I wanted to ask you about what the experience of writing a book was like. You're an injured worker, but also a longtime advocate and leader in the movement here in Ontario. What was it like to write? What was it like to write a book?
Well, it was a really useful exercise because so much of the time we're in, go mode or crisis mode, or oh my gosh, how are we going to respond to this or deal with that? And we oftentimes don't have that much time for reflection. And this whole process, in a way, was about reflection. It was about, okay, we did this project for 8 years. What do we want to do with it? How do we understand it? What were some of the key factors that led to what we thought was quite a successful partnership and an initiative, and then to be able to capture them and then share those with others. Like, it's such a busy world. You get 50, 100 emails every day. You're just going. You get caught up so much into what's happening right now. How do I manage that? And a lot of the, change takes a long time, and it takes capacity. It takes, numbers. It takes resources. It takes all kinds of things. So being able to kind of go, okay, all right, what are some of those important pieces? And then to be able to have it, as a resource, for, okay, we're working now with researchers, and they're saying, okay, let's work together. Back in the day, what that meant was, send us a letter of support that we can send to our funders, and then maybe we'll talk to you later, or maybe we won't. Now it's like, no, if you want to work with us, let's talk about what it is you want to do. Let's talk about what we need to be able to be active participants. So just our most recent little proposal here at Lakehead University, studying the impact of family members when a worker gets injured and has a long-term injury or disability. And we were able to integrate into the proposal that we'd have sessions before the research starts around understanding how the research works, about how to keep confidentiality, how to follow the ethical standards that universities have to do when they're doing research. We got to think about, who does this matter to? Who should we be connecting with in the community before we even get the money? So we've been talking to allies and unions, and almost everybody we talk to goes, yeah, this is a no-brainer. Of course, it affects the families. Yes, but there's very little interest or attention paid to this. So it creates more energy or synergy or whatever it is. It helps build the capacity of us injured workers to be more articulate, to be more knowledgeable, to have more control of our lives, of our partnerships, and that kind of spreads. Like, there's this inertia. So much happens with injured workers that you're done to over and over and over with very little control at all. The big red tape, big hand of WCB at any moment can just pull the plug, and don't even have to tell you why or how, whether that's, for your therapy or for your money or, access to medical, to be able to get more control in partnership. That inertia spreads. You kind of go, oh, maybe I got opportunity to gain more control over this part of my life. Okay, now maybe I can connect with others or provide support to others, which increases my confidence and my self-esteem and makes my life better. In a way, capturing this stuff in a book where other people can see it and then pick and choose, we kind of set it up so you can use it as a reference guide. You don't have to read the whole book if you don't want. You just want to find out about knowledge exchange. We got 2 or 3 chapters on that. You want to talk about building partnerships? I got some chapters on that. So you can use it as that reference, that how-to guide to up your game, so to speak.
It definitely reads as a tool for activism in certain ways, which is what makes it very interesting. Well, thank you so much, Steve. I really appreciate you taking the time to reflect on the book and the research project with me.
Oh, it's really my pleasure. Our hope is to see the book used in real life. So, over the last week or 10 days, talking to different academics, we're saying, look, if you're able to use this book in your classroom, can you then talk to us about that? How do you do it? What do you do that we can then share with others? Marion and I are thinking, okay, our next step is to do kind of workshops on how to use the book, and getting the experiences of others that are doing that is really the key to that process. Because, okay, we're definitely not objective, but to see how other people are doing it and sharing with others is so important. And we're hoping now to connect with more social justice groups to really support them or encourage them to kind of build up their capacity in the same way that we've been doing with injured workers.
We'll follow along with this next phase.
Thank you so much.
You have been listening to Labor Pains, an Injured Worker podcast produced by Injured Workers Community Legal Aid Clinic. Labor Pains is not a substitute for legal advice. For more information on workers' compensation issues, campaigns, and resources, visit InjuredWorkersOnline.org.